Hi everyone, welcome again. This introductory video is for chapter 19 of the Foner textbook, Safe for Democracy. And in this particular chapter, we're going to kind of see the growth of U.S. power throughout the late 19th and into the early 20th centuries. We're going to see that with all this tremendous growth in economic might, industrial might, that the United States starts flexing its muscles. It becomes more and more interested in different parts of the world. Some parts of the world, like the Western Hemisphere, where it had been interested for quite a while, but also spreading out from the Western Hemisphere into other parts of the world where really U.S. power had never really been able to be projected before. But now it can because of all these growths that we've seen in different parts of the American economy and indeed in American society in general. Now that's going to lead to issues as well, but things are happening. Things are changing in the United States. Many Americans want to see the U.S. become an empire, take its place on the world stage, feels it's earned that right because of this massive growth we've talked about. Some also see this as a call to go out and make the world a better place, in their opinion, for the U.S. to spread its democracy, its institutions to other peoples of the world, especially those in Asia and Africa, where they were seen by a lot of Americans and other Western Europeans as kind of backward areas, places that needed help. This idea is perpetuated in the late 19th and earlier 20th century that Western Europeans and North Americans like the United States should go out and help their little brown brothers. Another way of saying this is the white man's burden that Rudyard Kipling, a famous author of the late 19th and early 20th century from India, a member of the British peerage, he's going to kind of popularize this idea that these people need to be taken care of, that Westerners have superior cultural abilities, superior cultures in general, and they should export them to these people. Other Americans are also saying that these may be great, noble attributes to go out and help people live at a higher standard of living, have better cultural and political institutions, but some were a lot more practical. Alfred Thayer Mahan, right, a famous American admiral at the time, said, hey, look, we also need military bases. You can't be a great power. You can't be a great economic power without trade. And to have trade, you need to be able to protect it. So the United States needs military bases. So there's a lot of push here. A lot of people saying, hey, we need to go out and do these things. It's important for us and important for the people that we'll come in contact with. And then also kind of justifying all this are those ideas of social Darwinism that we've already talked about. These ideas put forward by people like Herbert Spencer, William Sumner, that said strong, powerful companies, strong, powerful countries can go out and do what they want. That's why they're big and strong and powerful, and that's why others are weak, because they can't handle things. They need to be helped. They need to be taken over. So there's a lot of impetus here for these things to happen. As you can see in these two cartoons at the bottom of the screen, there is a lot going on. In this first cartoon on the left, this is President William McKinley right here, and he looks to be fitting Uncle Sam, this individual, with new bigger clothes for these areas that are being taken over in the world. And over here are some of the media moguls of the time, people like Joseph Pulitzer, William Randolph Hearst, who appear to be kind of egging this on, saying that the United States needs to do these things. Over on this particular cartoon, you'll see once again President William McKinley, who seems to be serving up to Uncle Sam different parts of the world that are up for grabs, so to speak, even though they are parts of other empires or their own countries. Still, the United States feels that it has a right, an entitlement to these particular areas. So you can see there's a lot of strength happening here in the United States. There's a lot of aggressiveness that hadn't maybe existed on such a big level because of all these increases in economic power, military power, industrialization. Now that's going to kind of play itself out in things like the war with Spain, right, in that imperial moment in 1898 when the United States and Spain go to war essentially over the issues of Cuba, but also for those other issues we just talked about, the United States building an empire. And a lot of Americans feel that this particular war, the Spanish-American War, was an important war, was a good war, that we went through and took over these poorly run parts of the world by a poor, decrepit power in Spain and reinvigorated them, reformed them, made them upstanding, modern parts of the world, places like the Philippines, places like Hawaii, right? Not that all of these places were part of the Spanish Empire, but just these different areas the United States gains access to and control over. Now, of course, some people are going to worry that these new groups of people coming to the United States are dangerous, that they're going to somehow cause problems to our country, as you saw in some of the textbook readings, right? People like Presbyterian minister Josiah Strong, he's going to say that these are bad influences, that they're going to hurt our country, our culture. Right? So there's a lot of debate here. There's a lot of issues going on in the United States. But by and large, most Americans are behind this imperialistic movement, right? There's a growth of U.S. power. And they're going to find a lot of champions, especially people like the President of the United States, William McKinley, and then when he's assassinated, the next president, his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, who's a hero of the Spanish-American War and very much believes that the United States should go ahead and start flexing its muscle on the scene. As a matter of fact, when Theodore Roosevelt becomes president of the United States, he kind of buys into those social Darwinist ideas that big, powerful, civilized nations like the United States had a right to kind of impose their will on weaker, less civilized nations, for lack of a better term. Right? Roosevelt kind of codifies his ideas into what he called the big stick policy, that the United States should go around to other countries and make them conform, make them do what is expected of them by the United States. First, we would try to entreat with them, we would try to negotiate with them, but if that failed, then we would use military force. That's what was called the Roosevelt Corollary, this big stick policy. The United States has a right to intervene, especially in places like Latin America, South America, places that the United States had traditionally seen as its sphere of influence. Well, now Roosevelt said the United States definitely could intervene in these areas, could keep other countries from intervening as well. Countries like England or Germany, who sometimes had a lot of money invested in these countries, money that was then kind of absconded with, disappeared when these countries declared bankruptcy and said, we can't pay you back. Well, Germany or England would want their money back, would try to find a way to garnish that money, to take it from those countries. Roosevelt said, you can't do that. That's imperialism. That's you taking over these countries. The United States will not allow that. So you can see the United States is getting a lot more powerful, is really kind of making its presence known in the world, really starts to say that it needs to be consulted by these other big imperial powers like Germany, like Great Britain, like France, that we can't be ignored. Our interests have to be measured as well. To kind of prove that America is on the world scene now, Roosevelt sends the modern part of the United States Navy in 1907 on a world tour. He's going to send about 20 ships altogether on a tour all the way around the world, just to show that the United States now is a world power. It can be anywhere if it wants to. And on the political side, he's also going to kind of on foreign diplomacy. Roosevelt's going to broker an end to a small war between Russia and Japan in 1905. He's going to bring those two powers to Washington, D.C., and he's going to negotiate a treaty. So you can kind of see the United States is having a lot of influence in the world where it never really influenced before. This is a picture of the Great White Fleet, as it was known, this part of the U.S. Navy, this modern part of the U.S. Navy that's sent on tour by Roosevelt outside of Monterey Bay here in California, just a few hundred miles away from Fresno. So you can see that this is a big deal. A lot of Americans are going to come out, especially in California, to see all these ships, to see U.S. military power on display. As a matter of fact, on this map, you can see just how many times, both under Roosevelt's administration and other presidents that followed along after him, how many times the U.S. gets involved in other parts of Latin America or the Western Hemisphere, but especially here in the Caribbean, Mexico. U.S. intervention in those internal domestic issues is almost habitual, right? And especially in places like Haiti and Dominican Republic. Countries that had been parts of the French or the Spanish Empire, now independent countries. The United States comes in and actually occupies them and runs them for those countries because they're just deemed too inept, too corrupt, and not able to take care of themselves. So the United States is very active during this period, really kind of taking on this role of an imperial power. Another place where the United States gets very active, both for its economic interests but also for control purposes, right, is a place called Panama. Originally part of Colombia. It becomes a breakaway portion of Colombia after Colombia wants more money from the United States to allow the United States to build a canal in its territory. Well, the U.S. refuses to pay that additional money and helps the Panamanians break away from Colombia, in essence kind of helping set up a coup, one of the first times the United States is really going to do that. Eventually, once Panama establishes itself as a country, the U.S. recognizes it, works out a deal for several $100 million to come in and continue building a French project to build a canal in that country. And the United States is going to do it. where France had failed. The engineering was just too tough. It was too expensive. The French couldn't afford it. The United States steps in under Roosevelt and goes ahead and completes that project. It's going to cost $375 million. It's going to be the largest expenditure of federal funds in the history of the United States on any one single thing. The United States is going to spend $375 million. It won't be until the 1930s when they build the Hoover Dam outside of Las Vegas that we again spend that much money. So there are a lot of things happening. Again, the United States has a tremendous amount of economic and industrial and even monetary might that it can start throwing around on these different things. And it's really doing it during this period, kind of showing the world what it can do and accomplish. Imagine that, the United States, a relatively new country, a relatively rapidly industrializing country, can do something that France couldn't pull off. Right? Also a big industrial powerhouse. Once again, kind of showing you the area that comes under control. An important thing to notice kind of down here in this particular portion is that this section where this canal is going to be built is actually going to be called the U.S. Canal Zone. It's actually going to be part of United States territory, and people that live there are going to be considered United States citizens. As a matter of fact, John McCain, a U.S. Senator from Arizona who fought during the Vietnam War, he's going to be born in that canal zone. His father is going to be a U.S. military person stationed there. And because he was born there, he's considered a U.S. citizen and allowed him to run for president back in 2008. So the United States spreads out internationally, but it also is still in the midst of this thing called the progressive movement that we've talked about before. Theodore Roosevelt is really kind of a champion of this progressive movement of going in, fixing some of these economic and industrial issues that have been kind of present in the United States for a generation or 2 generations now, since the end of the Civil War. And when he gets ready to leave office in 1908, he handpicks his successor. And because Roosevelt controls the Republican Party machinery, if you will, he's able to kind of make sure his handpicked successor gets the nomination. And because the Republican machine is working so well at this particular time, Taft wins in a landslide with Roosevelt's endorsement. And he continues a lot of those policies that Roosevelt had of breaking up bad corporations, passing some regulations to make sure that companies don't mistreat their customers, don't abuse their power and influence. So the progressive period kind of keeps going hand in hand with these issues. So you can kind of see progressivism is limited in some respects. Progressives don't care about these international issues, don't care about race issues as much. They're much more interested in economic issues or these labor strifes that are kind of tearing the country apart in some ways. That's kind of where their focus is during this. But once Taft has been in office for 4 years, Roosevelt finds himself severely disappointed in his protege's work, that he doesn't feel Taft has gone far enough and done enough. He jumps back into the ring. Taft feels betrayed by his mentor, his friend, Theodore Roosevelt, and basically the Republican Party splits apart, which opens the door for the Democrats for the first time in a long time to be a relevant political party again. The Democrats put their candidate, Woodrow Wilson, out there as kind of an ultra-progressive, somebody that really wants to come in and shake things up, really wants to hem in corporations, really put some controls on them. So in essence, in 1912, you have 3 progressives running for President of the United States. That's how powerful the progressive movements become in the United States, that it is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. You can't escape it at this time. In the end, because of this split in the Republican Party between Taft and Roosevelt running as an independent, if you will, under a thing called the Progressive Party, that really kind of splits that conservative part of the progressive movement, leaves the door open to the Democrats. And as you can see in this map here, this electoral map of the 1912 election, it really looks like a landslide for Wilson. He gets all the electoral votes, but that's really because Roosevelt and Taft split the Republican vote. If only one of them had run, chances are they would have ended up as the president. But because of their differences, their personal strife, if you will, it leaves the door open to the Democrats. Woodrow Wilson becomes president of the United States, and he pushes through the end of the progressive agenda. All those things that the populace back in the 1880s and 1890s, those Farmers Alliance movements, all those things that they had wanted, things like direct election of senators, a progressive income tax, a Federal Reserve System, farm loan programs, all those things that have been called for a generation now are going to get pushed through. The progressive movement really hits its height during this period, right? During this period, at the same time where we're becoming an international power, where we're becoming interventionists in all kinds of different places, we're also finishing off the progressive movement. Of course, during Wilson's presidency, there's another kind of calamitous moment, if you will. In August of 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the kind of the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is assassinated while on tour in part of the Hungarian Empire, in Sarajevo, by a Serbian, a country that's right next door to that Bosnia-Herzegovina, this principality inside of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. When Franz Ferdinand is killed, it really kind of sparks off a chain of events. Many countries in Europe were aligned with each other, and as Austro-Hungarian Empire seeks to get revenge for the killing of its heir apparent against the Serbians, the Russians, who were allies of the Serbians, step in to protect their allies. As Russia starts to threaten Austro-Hungary, Germany steps in to protect its friend, its ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which means now that as it starts to threaten Russia, Russia's new ally, France, steps in to protect it. So you can see kind of a domino effect happens here in 1914. These big coalitions, these big kind of networks of alliances kind of start gaining momentum on their own. It really comes to a point where none of these countries can really stop themselves from going to war with one another. Brutal, long-lasting war. Millions of men are going to die. It's going to be popularized by things like trench warfare, chemical attacks, chemical warfare, air warfare. For the first time in history, men are going to fight each other in the skies as well as on the ground, as well as on the sea. But it's really going to be the sea that's going to be an issue for the United States. Wilson originally says the United States is not involved in this war. It doesn't have anything to do with this. That's a European war. Europeans are going to have to decide for themselves how things are going to settle out. But slowly but surely, this war starts spreading. It becomes a world war. World War I starts in August of 1914. The United States tries to sit on the sidelines. It actually works out well for the United States to not be aligned with either side because it allows them to sell to both sides. But eventually, most of our business, most of our American corporations end up doing business with Great Britain because it has access to sea lanes, things that the Germans can't do. The only thing the Germans can do is try to cut off British goods from reaching Britain through the use of their submarines, these new technology, these undersea vessels that allow them to sink ships virtually anywhere in the Atlantic. Well, one of the ships that is sunk by the Germans that is carrying munitions, war supplies for them, is a passenger ship called the Lusitania that has hundreds of Americans on board. And when that ship is sunk and Americans die, there is a big call in the United States to go to war with Germany, to teach them a lesson. Wilson resists. He says, no, this is not our war. We do not want to get involved here. Eventually, he's able to kind of cool off minds. Now, part of this is because Americans are kind of afraid of all these people that have moved into the United States in the past 20 or 30 years, right? And this big second wave of immigration. Wilson runs on a platform of keeping us out of war because he's afraid of how many Americans are from Germany, how many Americans are from Italy, how many Americans are from Eastern Europe, and all these different groups, their home countries where they came from just a few years ago, are now at war with each other. Wilson doesn't want that war to come here amongst our own people in our own cities. He wants to keep the United States out of war. So he runs on a policy of being prepared in case we do go to war, spending money on building up our military, but definitely trying to stay out of it. And he wins re-election in 1916 on this policy of staying out of the war but being prepared just in case things happen. Of course, eventually, tax on additional shipping and more American lives lost forces the United States to respond, and eventually the United States comes in on the side of Great Britain, France, and Russia against Germany and its allies. Now, once the United States goes to war, the mantra becomes, we're going to make the world safe for democracy, that we're going to work with democracies like Great Britain, like France, to make the world a better place. So you can see this progressive idea still there, that you can use government to go out and fight a war and make the world a better place, to fix the world. And millions of Americans are going to respond. They're going to get involved in this war in a big way. Millions volunteer, millions more are drafted as progressives get into government and start harnessing the power of government to put it to work to win this war. And it's going to be a bloody war. It's already been fought for 3 years in Europe by the time the United States declares war in 1917. And in the next year and a half or so that's left of the war, more than 100,000 Americans are going to die in that 18 months of combat that they're going to see. So this is a bloody affair, and America gets involved in it. Kind of towards the tail end, but definitely going to contribute their share of bodies to an already growing number. And when the United States goes to war, it's going to ask everybody to contribute, to do their part. African Americans are going to be drafted, brought into the United States military. Now, of course, it's still going to be a segregated military. The United States Army isn't looking at integrating anything. Those policies of segregation carry over into the military. African Americans are placed into their own units with white officers to lead them. Black officers aren't allowed at this time. The best African Americans can do is rise to the rank of high-ranking NCOs, non-commissioned officers, things like sergeants. But they're still going to be asked to go over and fight. And this is kind of the irony. They're being asked to go over and fight for democracy when their country at home doesn't allow them to vote in many cases. So there's a lot of irony that's not lost on African Americans. And a lot of African Americans are going to start thinking about, hey, why am I over here fighting for these people to have democracy when I don't have it at home? That's where that piece by Francis Grimke that you're going to read for this particular section is kind of important. It really kind of makes us stop and look at what's going on here. But also at the same time, Americans have to kind of harness their economic power to really make things work so that we can win this war. That becomes a big issue. And the government wants to explain to people why we have to go to war, why they have to support the war effort. They create a thing called the Committee on Public Information, the Wilson administration does, to sell Americans on the war effort, to tell them what they're fighting for. As you can see in these posters, on the one side here we have a German soldier that really kind of looks more like a zombie, right? A monster of some type. You can see blood dripping off of his weapon here, right? His hands are bloody, right? Keep them back. This is what you're fighting for, is to keep this person away from you, to keep it away from America. On the other side, here's Americans fighting for democracy, fighting for the right things, fighting for liberty. Boy Scouts helping sell war bonds, right? So it really kind of depicts what the United States thinks it stands for. The United States stands for goodness, the right, democracy, the good things in life. Their enemy, the Germans, totalitarianism, oppression, murder, death. And at the same time, the government starts trying to tell all these new groups of people that have come here, especially from places like Germany that are the enemy now, right? They try to tell German Americans, act American, be loyal, don't step out. And that's a big issue. A lot of people are really worried about these big groups of immigrants that have come into the United States. In places like Ohio, where a lot of Germans live, there are riots against German Americans. Their businesses are destroyed. They're chased out of town. They're not allowed to go to public schools anymore. There's a lot of fear running rampant in the United States during this period. This is exactly what Wilson and other leaders in his administration had been afraid of at the beginning of the war in 1914. To kind of clamp down on these things, to make sure that these different groups of people that are here don't cause problems, the Wilson administration passes things called the Espionage and Sedition Acts in 1917 and 1918, restricting free speech, making anybody that stands up against the war, especially socialist leaders like Eugene Debs of the International Workers of the World, they stand up and speak out against the war, saying the U.S. shouldn't be involved in this. They're arrested a lot of times, never actually charged with anything, but just left in jail for long periods of time under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. So once again, you see the power of the government growing. Progressives using these new laws, these new government institutions like the Committee on Public Information, like these laws passed, like the Espionage and Sedition Act, to make things happen, to harness the power of the United States and fight the war effort in the way they see fit. Women also step forward, doing their part. Now, they've been pushing for the vote, the right to become members of the political body in the United States, all through the late 19th century and now into the 20th century. A lot of women put that on hold, showing that they're going to be responsible citizens by going into the factories to do work for the war effort, not agitating for the vote. Now, some women are going to continue to push, continue to hold demonstrations. Alice Paul's group. The National Women's Party is going to do this all throughout the war, holding demonstrations in front of the White House saying, you can ask us to go to work, but you won't let us vote. That doesn't seem fair. Again, fighting for democracy, but we don't allow half the population, women, to vote, seems kind of incongruous, right? So there's a lot going on during this particular period when we're saying we're making the world safe for democracy, but at the same time, we're kind of questioning what is democracy here in our own country and who has it and who has it available. Of course, once the United States enters the war, it's only a matter of time before Germany and its allies are defeated. With so many American men, more than 5 million men going to be brought into the military, with our large modern Navy being used as well, it's only a matter of time before Germany is defeated. And as a matter of fact, by mid-1918, the handwriting's kind of on the wall in Germany, and by the fall of 1918, the Germans are coming to the negotiating tables to try and end the war. For the first time in history, a United States president leaves the White House during his administration and leaves the country. Now, Roosevelt had left the White House too and toured around the country. Lincoln before him had done it in a very limited way. But now, a president actually leaves the country to go and negotiate the end of this war himself, because Wilson has a vested interest in this. Because of the amount of death, the tens of millions of people that have died in this war, 100,000 of them Americans, Wilson really doesn't want this to happen again. Again, he's a progressive. He wants to say, hey, we can make this not happen if we have a mechanism in place, a way to harness government to check these excesses that have led to this terrible, awful war. And his answer to this is a thing called the League of Nations, a place where countries can come together to negotiate their differences, a place where they can talk freely amongst themselves and explain to each other that if one country becomes belligerent, becomes aggressive, that other countries are going to gang up against them and keep that from happening. The only problem is when Wilson gets to Versailles, a city outside of Paris, where this treaty to end World War I is going to be negotiated, he finds that he really doesn't have any support for this policy. Nobody's really interested in this League of Nations. Countries like France, Great Britain had fought this war largely to get at Germany, to really knock it down, to really keep it from competing against them. And now that it was defeated, they wanted to make this war worth something to them. They wanted to gain territory. They wanted to gain money back to help pay for their war effort. So Wilson really has to do a lot of hard negotiating here at Versailles to get these things to happen. Eventually, he's able to twist enough arms to get France, Great Britain, Italy, the other great powers of Europe to sign on to this League of Nations. Now all he has to do is go home and sell it to the American people. But once he gets home in 1919 to the United States and goes to the U.S. Senate to sell this treaty, he finds there's a lot of opposition. A lot of Americans aren't interested in this. They're afraid that the United States is going to get dragged into war after war after war. Americans, after paying such a heavy price of 100,000 deaths in a little over a year's time, don't want to see more American troops going to war. They really don't feel that this war is worth anything, especially in the aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles, where Germany is punished so harshly by France and Great Britain for its actions, that a lot of Americans just think that this is not what we fought for. We fought to make the world safe for democracy, and in the end, it doesn't appear like anybody's any better off. So it fails. And if the United States doesn't join this League of Nations, now the biggest economy in the world, now we're one of the biggest military powers in the world, if we're not going to join this League of Nations, it really means it doesn't have a lot of power, doesn't have the influence it should have. The League of Nations, while it does become an entity, is missing its most vital part, the United States of America. Another factor that kind of comes in here at the end of World War I is with kind of the breakdown of these old hegemonic empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, German Empire, even the Russian Empire. They all kind of collapse at the end of World War I, kind of fall apart, if you will. And one of the things that really hastens the end of the Russian Empire is the fact that it has an internal revolution. Different groups inside of Russia fight back against their imperial government, take it down. One of those groups is called the Bolsheviks. They're a communist party, an ideological group based on the writings of Karl Marx. And slowly but surely, they take control of this new country's government. Right? The Russian imperial government falls, a new government comes in, and the Bolsheviks take that over. And one of the interesting things that these Bolsheviks, these Russian communists, kind of sign on to, they kind of pledge themselves to, is taking their revolution international to other industrialized countries, especially those in Europe and even into the United States. And at the end of World War I, these Bolsheviks start trying to export their revolution to other neighboring countries, places in Eastern Europe, places like Poland, places like Germany, and they start gaining adherents. They start actually disrupting governments, and it scares a lot of people. And then when here in the United States, we start going back to having worker strife, we start having big strikes held by these new unions that have come on the scene. It really scares a lot of people. They look around and say, hey, it looks like these communist influences are making their way here, possibly through these immigrant groups that have come, but regardless, it looks dangerous. And Americans, especially after Seattle has a big worker strike for better pay in 1919, after years of price freezes during the war, or wage freezes during the war, a lot of workers want to see more money. They want to see better working conditions. They go on strike for that. Eventually, it grows into a general strike, which means everybody that is part of a union in any particular area, in any particular work category, goes on strike to kind of show their solidarity. It scares a lot of people. The United States government calls out federal troops to put down these strikes. Leads to a lot of strife. More cities join in as more and more federal troops are called in, and it scares a lot of people. Hundreds of people end up getting injured in these different riots in different cities. Several are killed. And a lot of people think that behind all of this is not just the old company owner union workers strife that had been going on since the 1870s. A lot of them see this as being part of this new ideological party in Russia, the Bolshevik communists. And they see that this is part of that growing fear of these anarchists, these different groups of people coming over and upsetting the nation. And it goes even beyond just worker strife, just these different strikes happening in the United States. There's also, during this particular time, a bombing campaign that takes place in the United States, led by anarchists, people that don't want government whatsoever, often European immigrants that have come here to the United States. And they go on kind of a bombing binge during this same period when there's these worker strikes all through the northwest, places like Seattle, places like San Francisco. Even the Attorney General of the United States, A. Mitchell Palmer, his house in Washington, D.C. is bombed by these radicals. So he goes on kind of a personal vendetta against them, starts going out and arresting anybody that's suspected of being with these anarchists or possibly a communist, arrests more than 4,000 people, all without warrants, and even deports them, some of them to the Soviet Union, as radicals, as undesirables in the United States, all without ever having a trial. A lot of places start outlawing radical unions, what they consider to be dangerous people, like the International Workers of the World, that union that had really kind of been the loudest champion for the worker, really wanted to see the most radical change in worker conditions in the United States. State after state starts making it illegal to be a member of that type of a union. So you can see there's a lot of backlash here in the end of the 1910s. That progressive agenda is kind of collapsing on itself. It's kind of spent itself in the years before World War I. The last vestiges of the progressivism are going to be pushing through the vote for women and then prohibition as well at the same time. So by 1920, this progressive agenda has kind of fallen apart. All these new worries are kind of coming to the fore in the United States. This international turmoil that's out there, and then even this domestic turmoil that seems to be following it home here to the United States. So kind of taking a look at this, right? Big thing to kind of see here is the United States is now a major player in the world. A lot of things can't happen in the world without kind of our say-so, without our input in things. But there are limits. The United States is not terribly interested in taking on this role of being the world's policeman, the world's kind of final arbitrator, if you will. Great Britain and France, even to a smaller extent, or to a much lesser extent, Germany and Russia still are major countries that have to be kind of acknowledged and kind of looked at, right? You can't ignore them still. They're still way too important, especially Great Britain, still really the world's dominant economy, still the world's dominant empire, and still the world's dominant military, really. But one thing we can see is during this period, all through the progressive movement and then through World War I, the federal government's power has grown. The federal government is involved in more and more things in Americans' lives, where after the Civil War, all through the 1870s and 1880s, the United States government wasn't really involved in a person's life directly other than maybe getting you your mail. Now you can run into the federal government in a lot of different places. There are federal agents going about the country looking for undesirables, dangerous elements in our society. There are federal bureaus now watching corporations, watching unions, monitoring what's happening in the United States. So progressives have really kind of put together a more powerful government to make sure that these things get done that they wanted to see done. Better working conditions, better cities, cleaner cities, better run companies, less corporate abuse, all those things. At the same time, there are a lot of issues with immigration still. A lot of Americans during World War I, even before then, were really worried about these new groups of people coming in and changing the country, making us a different type of a country. And now they're kind of still worried about these different groups of people, especially after the violence that happens after World War I in those worker strikes, in those great general strikes in the Northwest and other parts of the country, after these bombing campaigns that go throughout the United States. A lot of Americans have problems with these new groups of people that are in the United States, want to really limit their influence, really want to Americanize them as quickly and as efficiently as possible, or push them out, or keep more of them from coming in. So there's a lot of concerns here, and not least of which is this thing called the Red Scare, this fear of communist revolution taking place everywhere across the world, being exported to the United States. A lot of Americans are looking for safety, what the next presidential candidate in 1920 is going to call normalcy. He wants to return to normalcy, kind of sanity in the United States, kind of get past all these progressive agendas, get past all these scary moments with all this strife, all this conflict that's happening in the United States. Warren G. Harding, the next Republican candidate for president, is going to tell Americans it's time to return to normal, and his message is going to be accepted in a big way by Americans. So please look over everything, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.